Everyone laughed when he built a tent instead of a cabin. They said it was irresponsible. They said his children wouldn't survive the winter. But when January came and the temperature fell to nearly 60 degrees below zero, something uncomfortable happened. The tent was 35 degrees warmer than every log cabin around it, while burning less than a quarter of the fuel. This isn't a story about genius. It's a story about how the houses everyone trusted were quietly failing, and how the one everyone mocked exposed a mistake we're still repeating today. If you've ever wondered why modern housing feels exhausting to maintain, why comfort disappears the moment the system stops feeding it, or why normal homes demand so much effort just to stay livable, this story explains more than you might expect. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe to Simple Shift Living. We don't chase trends here. We examine the quiet decisions that shape how we live. In the autumn of 1896, America still believed in the frontier as a promise. Newspapers talked about opportunity, about land waiting to be claimed, about men who went north poor and returned rich. But far from the headlines, on a cold stretch of remote ground where winter decided everything, reality looked very different. By early November, the last supply boats had already turned back south. What remained was a scattered camp of men preparing for 7 months of isolation, darkness, and temperatures that regularly fell below 40 degrees. There would be no deliveries, no help, no second chances. This was the season when houses decided who lived comfortably and who merely survived. Most men were building log cabins the way they had been taught. Thick timber walls, heavy roofs, open fireplaces, cabins that looked permanent, serious, respectable. Building one required tools, time, and money, axes, saws, nails, draft animals. For many, the cost ran close to $1,000, a small fortune at the time, equivalent to several years of wages back home. But in places like this, cost was confused with safety. If you could afford a cabin, you belonged. One man couldn't. He arrived with his wife, 2 young children, and less than $300 left to last the entire winter. That money had to cover food, basic supplies, and fuel. Every dollar burned too quickly would be gone before spring. He knew it. Everyone else did too. While the rest of the camp raced to raise squared walls before the ground froze solid, this man did something that immediately set him apart. He didn't cut trees, he didn't haul logs, he didn't lay out a rectangular foundation. Instead, he marked out a circle. Then he began digging, 18 inches down into the frozen earth, slowly, methodically, as others watched from a distance. What rose from that hole didn't look like a house at all. Canvas, rope, hides, stones gathered from the riverbank. A structure that sloped inward instead of standing tall and proud. A tent. The reaction was instant. Men laughed openly, not quietly, not politely. This was frontier laughter, sharp, certain, and unforgiving. Someone joked that the wind would take it before Thanksgiving. Another said the children wouldn't last until Christmas. A third, louder than the rest, said what many were thinking: this isn't a place for experiments. Help was offered everywhere else, timber shared, tools lent, extra hands given to men building real houses. But when it came to the tent, help stopped. No one wanted to be associated with a mistake. No one wanted to waste energy on something that looked temporary. And that word, temporary, hung in the air like a verdict. In places like this, temporary meant dangerous. Temporary meant irresponsible. Temporary meant you didn't understand where you were. The man didn't argue. He didn't explain. He kept working. As the days shortened and the temperature dropped into the teens, the log cabins began to take shape. Solid, heavy, reassuring. Fires burned constantly inside them, even before winter truly arrived. Wood disappeared faster than anyone had planned. Axes rang from morning to night as men tried to stay ahead of the cold. Inside the tent house, there was no fire yet, Just layers being added, canvas on the outside, wool beneath, hide beneath that. Stones stacked carefully in the center, not like a fireplace, but like something being stored. The children helped where they could, small hands carrying what little weight they were able to manage. Their presence made the mockery sharper. People don't forgive risk when children are involved. By late November, the first real cold settled in. The kind that doesn't shock all at once, but drains warmth steadily, hour by hour. Cabins that looked solid on the outside began to reveal their weaknesses. Smoke filled the air. Chimneys pulled heat upward faster than fires could replace it. Men woke through the night to feed flames, already exhausted before winter had properly begun. The tent house stood quietly among them. No chimney, no roaring fire, no visible struggle. That silence was unsettling. At night, lantern light flickered through the canvas walls. In the mornings, there was no panic, no frantic cutting of wood before breakfast. The man's family moved slowly, deliberately, as if they weren't racing something unseen. Still, no one believed it would last. Log cabins had history behind them, tradition, stories passed down from fathers and grandfathers. The tent had none of that. It looked like poverty made visible, like a gamble taken because there was no other choice. Winter hadn't arrived yet, everyone knew that. And when it did, people were certain of one thing: the cold would expose the foolishness. The tent would fail, the numbers would catch up. Reality always did. For now, there was laughter and confidence, and the quiet belief that survival belonged to those who built the way everyone agreed was right. The season of proof was still coming. What unsettled people most wasn't that the tent house looked weak. It was that it didn't follow the rules they believed kept people alive. In a place where winter punished hesitation, seriousness was measured by weight, by how many logs a man stacked, how thick his walls were, how much smoke poured from his chimney. Heavy meant safe, permanent meant responsible, and this house rejected all of it. It curved inward instead of standing firm. It sat low to the ground, half hidden, as if trying not to be noticed. From the outside, it looked like something meant to be packed up and moved on from, not trusted with a family's survival. Men passing by shook their heads, counting in their minds how fast canvas would freeze, how quickly heat would escape, how little protection it offered against wind that could peel bark from trees. They assumed the man had chosen the tent because it was cheaper, because he'd run out of money, because he was cutting corners and hoping luck would carry him through. What they didn't see was that money was already part of the calculation. Firewood was not free. Every log cost time, calories, and risk. Cutting it meant hours in sub-zero air, fingers stiffening, sweat turning dangerous the moment the axe stopped swinging. Hauling it meant strength he couldn't afford to waste. With less than $300 to last the winter, burning wood carelessly wasn't just inefficient, it was fatal. A cabin demanded constant feeding day and night, and that demand never stopped. Miss one night, oversleep once, let a fire die for too long, and the house punished you immediately. The tent house asked for something different. Instead of height, it used depth, dug into earth that never reached the same killing cold as the air above it. Instead of solid walls, it used layers, materials that trapped air and slowed loss instead of trying to overpower it. Instead of an open hearth that sent heat racing upward and out, it gathered stone at the center like a savings account, storing warmth instead of spending it all at once. None of this looked impressive. There was no visible strength to admire. No towering walls, no dramatic flames, and because it didn't look serious, people treated it like a mistake waiting to happen. They passed by and joked about the first storm flattening it, about the children waking up frozen, about how desperation made people believe strange things. What they couldn't feel yet was the quiet inside that space, the way the air didn't rush or leak, the way warmth didn't vanish the moment a flame went down, the way effort stopped turning into loss. From the outside, it looked like poverty, From the inside, it was already behaving like a system that understood winter far better than the houses everyone trusted. Winter never arrives all at once. It tests first. The temperature slips below zero for a night, then rises just enough to give people confidence. Then it drops again, harder, longer, and refuses to leave. By mid-December of 1896, the test was over. The cold settled in with intention. Days shortened into a dull blue twilight. Nights stretched endlessly. The kind of cold that doesn't shock the body, but drains it slowly, making every task cost more than it should. Inside the log cabins, fires were already burning without pause. Men fed them before sleep, woke to feed them again, and still stepped onto frozen floors at dawn. Woodpiles shrank at a pace no one had planned for. A cabin that looked solid on the outside revealed its truth inside. Heat rose, rushed toward the chimney, and vanished. Smoke thickened the air. Eyes burned, coughs lingered, water buckets froze if they were left too far from the hearth. Some men began sleeping in their coats, not because they were careless, but because they were losing ground. Each cabin demanded attention the way a hungry animal does. Miss a feeding and it punished you. Every extra degree of warmth came at the cost of another log, another hour in the dark, another risk taken with numb hands and stiff joints. Food consumption rose as bodies tried to compensate for the cold. Fatigue crept in early, then stayed. And quietly, winter began taking things. Time first, then strength, then margin. The camp grew tense, irritable, smaller in spirit. Meanwhile, the tent house did something that bothered people more than if it had failed outright. It remained calm. There was no frantic cutting of wood at dawn. No chimney smoke pouring through the long night. The man burned a short, hot fire in the evening and then let it die. After that, the house went still. Inside, the air didn't swing wildly from hot to freezing. The floor stayed tolerable. The walls didn't sweat or drip. The children slept through the night without being woken to feed flames or pile on more layers. Outside, men noticed small things they couldn't explain away. Frost thick on cabin roofs, but not forming the same way on the tent. Footprints in the snow leading to woodpiles again and again for some houses and not for others. At first, no one said anything. Admitting concern felt too close to admitting doubt. But as the cold deepened and the days of constant burning turned into weeks, it became harder to ignore the pattern. The cabins were fighting winter and losing ground inch by inch. The tent house wasn't fighting at all. It was waiting, holding, conserving. And winter, still far from its worst, was already deciding which approach it respected. By January of 1897, winter stopped testing and started enforcing. The temperature dropped past 40 degrees, then lower, until the air itself felt solid. Breath crystallized instantly. Metal burned skin on contact. Sound carried strangely in the cold, sharp and brittle. This was the stretch of winter that ended arguments, because opinion didn't survive conditions like this. Only results did. Inside the log cabins, the situation had deteriorated fast. Fires were burning almost continuously, consuming 150 to 200 pounds of wood every single day, yet the air inside struggled to climb much above freezing. Some cabins hovered around 15 to 25 degrees, even with flames roaring. Chimneys pulled heat upward in a constant draft that no amount of effort could stop. Men woke to ice forming on the inside of walls. Water froze overnight. Sleep came in short, restless stretches between stoking the fire and checking that nothing had gone wrong. Fatigue compounded. Woodpiles thinned at a rate that terrified even the most optimistic men. And then there was the tent. When someone finally stepped inside during one of the coldest nights, part curiosity, part disbelief, the argument ended without a word being spoken. The air inside was warm, not survival warm, comfortably warm. A thermometer hanging near the center read 50 to 60 degrees, depending on the hour. That was 35 to 45 degrees warmer than any log cabin in the camp, at a moment when the outside temperature was nearly 60 degrees. There was no roaring fire, no frantic feeding of fuel. The flames had burned hours earlier and were long gone. What remained was stored warmth, slowly released, steady and even. The man had burned less than 40 pounds of wood the entire evening. One short fire. That was it. The contrast was brutal. While cabins devoured wood and still failed to hold heat, this house held warmth without asking for more. No drafts, no violent swings in temperature, no smoke-filled air, just a quiet interior that stayed stable while everything outside it fought and lost. At that point, laughter didn't fade. It vanished. No one needed convincing. The numbers were too clear. A structure everyone had dismissed as temporary, irresponsible, even dangerous, was outperforming the strongest cabins in the camp by a margin so large it felt humiliating. This wasn't preference anymore, it wasn't belief, it was arithmetic. And arithmetic in a winter like this decided who was right. The numbers alone should have been enough, but what truly broke the resistance wasn't the temperature difference or the fuel savings. It was the children. In the log cabins, winter had begun to show itself in quieter ways. Smoke hung low inside rooms where fires never stopped burning. Eyes stayed red, coughs lingered longer than they should have. Children woke at night when the fire dipped too low or when the air grew too thick to breathe easily. Parents learned to listen for small sounds in the dark. The scrape of boots toward the hearth, the crack of settling logs, the sharp inhale of cold air that meant something had gone wrong. In the tent house, there was no such vigilance. The children slept through the night. They woke warm, their breath not fogging the air above their blankets, their fingers not stiff with cold. There was no smoke curling through the space, no panic when a fire burned out, no rush to feed flames before dawn. Men who stepped inside noticed it immediately, even if they didn't want to. The quiet, the steadiness, the way the children moved without the heaviness winter had placed on everyone else. That was the moment the tone changed. Questions replaced jokes. Men who had refused to share timber weeks earlier now stood at the entrance, hats in their hands, asking how the heat stayed. One admitted quietly that he had expected the family to fail, that he had assumed the tent was a gamble taken at the children's expense. Saying it out loud sounded worse than thinking it. The man didn't argue or defend himself. He didn't need to. The house had already answered. The stones at the center still radiated warmth hours after the fire had gone out. The walls felt alive in a way solid logs never did, warm to the touch, holding what they were given instead of bleeding it away. Someone asked how much wood he burned. When he answered, the number landed harder than any lecture could have. Others did the math on their own, comparing it to their shrinking piles outside. Pride gave way to practicality. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in the only way it ever does, through necessity. No one wanted to admit they had been wrong, but no one wanted to watch their children suffer through another month of cold either. That winter, the tent stopped being a joke. It became a reference point. And once that happened, nothing in the camp felt as certain as it had before. Once people stopped arguing about whether it worked, the only question left was why. The answer wasn't cleverness, and it wasn't luck. It was that the tent house followed a different logic than every cabin around it. The log cabins were built to look strong. Thick walls, straight lines, open fireplaces, structures meant to reassure the eye. But they operated like open systems. Heat rushed in and rushed back out just as fast. Fire warmed the air briefly, then sent most of its energy straight up the chimney. Cold air slipped in through gaps no amount of chinking could permanently seal. The house demanded constant attention, constant fuel, constant labor, and punished any lapse immediately. The tent house did the opposite. It treated heat as something to be stored, not chased. The fire wasn't the point. It was just a tool used briefly to charge the system. Stone absorbed that heat and released it slowly through the night, long after flames were gone. Layers of material trapped air and kept it still, turning the walls themselves into insulation instead of conduits for loss. The circular shape reduced exposed surface, giving winter less to attack. Digging into the earth brought the living space closer to a temperature that didn't swing violently with the air. Nothing in the design fought the cold directly. It redirected it, slowed it, and waited it out. This wasn't new knowledge. It was old knowledge applied without apology. Cultures that lived where winter killed quickly had learned not to build houses that demanded constant energy just to remain tolerable. They built shelters that forgave mistakes, that held warmth even when fires died, that didn't require waking in the night to survive until morning. The tent house looked fragile because it refused excess. But excess was exactly what winter punished most. In a season where every extra task cost strength and every extra log shortened the future, efficiency became safety. The cabin burned effort. The tent conserved it. And once that distinction was understood, the outcome felt less like a surprise and more like an overdue correction. Change didn't arrive as an announcement. There was no meeting, no agreement, no moment where everyone admitted the old way had failed. It moved the way winter itself does, slowly, inevitably, without asking permission. One by one, men began making small adjustments to their cabins, careful not to draw attention to themselves at first. Stones appeared indoors where open hearths once dominated. Blankets and hides were hung along interior walls, not for decoration, but to trap air where solid logs had been trusted too much. Some men dug shallow trenches around their cabins to break the wind at ground level. Others shortened their chimneys, trying to slow the upward escape of heat. No one called it copying. They called it trying something. But everyone knew where the ideas came from. Wood consumption began to drop, not dramatically at first, but enough to be noticed. A man who had been burning through his pile at an alarming rate suddenly found it lasting longer. Nights became quieter, less frantic movement in the dark, fewer boots scraping toward the fire at midnight, less smoke hanging in the air by morning. The camp's rhythm changed. Where men had once spent 6 or 7 hours a day cutting and hauling wood just to stay alive, some now needed only half that. The saved time didn't turn into leisure. It turned into rest, into repairs, into the simple ability to sit without calculating how long the fire would last. The tent house became a place people visited, not out of curiosity anymore, but to measure. They touched the stones, counted the layers, traced the shape with their eyes. They asked about timing, when to burn, how long, how hot. The answers were always the same and always simple. Short, intense fire. Then stop. Let the house do the rest. By late winter, the laughter felt distant, almost embarrassing, like something remembered from a different season. The camp hadn't changed its beliefs so much as it had been forced to revise them. The strongest house was no longer the heaviest one. The safest shelter wasn't the one that looked permanent. It was the one that demanded the least from people already stretched thin. And once that realization settled in, it didn't stay contained. It moved outward, from cabin to cabin, quietly rewriting what common sense meant in a place where winter didn't care how things had always been done. What happened that winter didn't stay in the past because it was never really about tents or cabins. It was about a mistake people keep repeating. The men who laughed weren't cruel or ignorant. They were relying on what had always worked for them, in places that looked similar enough to feel familiar. The log cabin had kept generations alive. It was proven, respected, and deeply tied to identity. But proven in one environment doesn't mean appropriate in another. That winter exposed how easily tradition turns into assumption, and how dangerous it becomes when conditions change but thinking doesn't. The tent house wasn't better because it was smaller or cheaper or unconventional. It was better because it understood cost in the only way winter recognizes ongoing effort. It asked for less fuel, less labor, less attention, and in return, it offered stability. That same pattern exists now, just in quieter forms. Many modern houses work the same way those cabins did. They leak energy constantly and demand continuous payment to remain comfortable. When the input stops, when money tightens, when energy prices rise, when systems fail, the comfort disappears almost immediately. We've learned to accept that as normal. We call it the cost of living, but that winter shows another possibility. A house can be designed to forgive, to hold what it's given, to reduce the effort required just to exist inside it. The tent didn't save people because it was radical. It saved them because it was honest about limits. It didn't pretend resources were endless or that labor was free. It worked with the environment instead of fighting it. That's why the story still matters. Not because we should all live in tents, but because we keep building houses that assume constant input and endless margin, then wonder why people feel exhausted maintaining them. The uncomfortable lesson isn't about the past, it's about the present. Sometimes the most fragile-looking solutions are the ones that understand reality best. And sometimes the houses everyone agrees are normal are the ones quietly demanding more than most people can afford to give.